Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We are going to give people another minute or two to join, and then we will get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on optimizing the fulfillment process in the context of ASC 606. Today's webinar is a joint effort by Softrax and our longtime partner, Changepoint. Presenting today will be Greg Davidson from Changepoint and Tom Zauli from Softrax. Greg has more than 25 years of experience in the information technology industry, encompassing software support, development, pre-sales, professional services, and product management. In addition to his 14 years with Changepoint, he has held various leadership positions in different market verticals within the IT space. Welcome, Greg. Tom is the general manager here at Softrax. He has worked in the area of automating complex back-office processing for 7 years with the company. Prior to this, he has over 20 years of experience with various software companies, but started his career as an electrical engineer for GE Aerospace, focused on complex command and control. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you.
Our agenda today will be as follows. We'll start out by reviewing the problem space and the impact of ASC 606. We will then move into discussions of recent events that further complicate the issue and the infrastructure options to solve the problem. We'll end today by reviewing the benefits and potential reach of these solutions, followed by any questions. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Any questions you have can be submitted through the presentation using the GoToWebinar's question box, and answers will be provided at the end of today's presentation as time allows. If we don't get to you today, we will contact you directly after the webinar with our responses. You can also download the presentation from your GoToWebinar session. And lastly, just a reminder that this webinar is being offered for CPE credit. It does come with a disclaimer that the information presented today constitutes advice and should not be acted on without first discussing your specific circumstances with a fulfillment professional from Changepoint or a revenue automation professional from Softrax. So, with all of that said, let's go ahead and launch our first polling question. The first polling question today is, which of the following best describes your company's status to meet the requirements of ASC 606? I'll give you a few minutes or a few seconds to respond, and then we'll review the results. Okay, looks like people are trickling in. looks like we have come to a good stopping point. Let's go ahead and close the poll and review the results. So it looks like 22% have not started and don't see an impact at this point. 16% of you have adopted the guidance but have not operationalized it at this point. 7% have adopted the guidance and do not plan to operationalize. And 56% of you have adopted and completed the efforts to operationalize the guidance. Tom, is that what you expected in here?
I think it's pretty much as expected. I think probably the most notable is the percentage of people that have adopted and completed their efforts to operationalize has gone up, I think, significantly since the last time we ran this poll. So it sounds like people are getting things done, which is good. Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and get things started. Tom, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So I thought I'd just say a few words about the problem space initially. We have an hour here, so unfortunately we can't get into all of the detail that goes in, that's involved in both sides of the equation. But I think, at least at a high level, I think what you have is and really we're speaking to organizations that run complex services business or in another way have complex fulfillment events that they need to capture. In those situations, even prior to ASC 606, there were really two sets of problems and then a third. I think the first two were just in terms of managing a large services organization. When the focus is sort of optimal margin, optimal customer satisfaction, careful planning, risk mitigation, there are a number of things that have to occur, and I certainly think that software such as Changepoint, as Sarah mentioned, we've been longtime partners because of the depth of the depth of functionality to address these problems. That issue on its own is in my opinion, a very complex issue and well handled. On the financial side, the process of handling the guidance, even in 605, certainly in 606, again on its own, between managing the billing, the revenue recognition, keeping track of cash, it itself is a complex problem. What we wanted to address in this webinar was not just a bit on those two problems, but really the third problem that it comes when you're trying to then integrate these two things. And because 606 is new, we wanted to speak a little bit about the impacts that we see from 606 on this, which we don't think are trivial. I mean, there's some significant impacts that we thought it would be beneficial for people to be aware of. You can probably go to the next slide there. One thing I will say, and this is not certainly anything new. I think most people would agree with this, and I believe it was commonly held in the former guidance, is that in terms of the financial close process specifically, as I talk to CFOs and CAOs around the country, go to conferences, talk to analysts, I mean, very, very often the long pole in the tent of the close process, particularly for those companies that have complex fulfillment, high volume fulfillment, has been the collection of those events to close their books, and it's been a very noted pain point, if you will. For a lot of companies, I mean, there are certainly many companies out there that have this all locked down. Our perspective is possibly skewed because we never hear from them. I mean, the people that we are talking to invariably have a process that, for whatever reason, is not optimized. It's either done in spreadsheets, Excel, emails going back and forth, what have you. And in that case, those companies, I think they struggle in terms of just operationalizing the whole thing, and really with limited opportunity to really understand the future and plan effectively. So we'll speak a little bit on that today as well. Go to the next slide. Three areas of 606, just to state them at the sort of the highest level, that seem to be causing problems specific to this problem. One is the disclosure requirement around managing the contract asset and liability positions. So I've closed an order for some work. In the asset case, I've started to perform prior to billing. under 606, I can usually recognize that revenue, but I have to disclose the amount of that revenue that is truly unbilled. And on the liability side, I've billed for it, I've possibly even collected the cash, but I have not performed yet, and I have to disclose that as well as a liability. The other requirement that's causing some headaches out there is the allocation requirement, which is, now getting applied more broadly. Would typically occur when you're selling multiple performance obligations, either on the same order or coincidence in time, where there's discounts involved and other things that trigger you into the allocation guidance around standalone selling price. And then the third, which admittedly we've seen less of, we think it's there. It's just a question of people, full embracement of the guidance, I guess I would say, and that's in handling contract modifications and combinations and the retrospective or prospective allocations and other events that can go along with those. What we're going to do next is go through an example that sort of illustrates how fulfillment, billing, and RevRec have to really be synced up for all this to work and be operationalized. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So a little bit of humor here. I call this a horrific example, and I say that occurs all the time. I mean, we tried to come up with something, fairly specific. It rears its ugly head in different ways depending on the organization and the business, but we'll walk through it and walk through some of the areas that, where we see problems, and hopefully it'll provide a good framework. And so in this example, fairly straightforward. It's just a company that's closing business that involves delivery of a tangible good, maybe a piece of hardware, some services, and some ongoing support. So maybe you could think of it like, there's some software on the hardware that's supported. And just to make things a little bit more involved, 2 months into the project, there's another order which triggers the modification guidance. And a third one, which, I guess you would think that it would not be that common, but we see it literally all the time, which is that the services wind down after a certain period of time, meaning that if it was, let's say it was $1,000 of services, to put a number out there, it's all been billed. There's more work to be done. Rather than issuing new paperwork, the client just gives the okay and says, you can just keep billing us on the paperwork that you have. And that creates problems for the back office. Keeps things simple for the front office, problems for the back office. So we threw that in there as well. So we'll just go through this sort of piece by piece. From a fulfillment perspective, the events that we would see is the order would be passed, either entered into or passed to the fulfillment system. And the fulfillment system has to handle all the tasks of managing the project plan, getting the resources assigned, all of the activities that would go along with managing the project and managing the team. The billing team, they've got to get the billings out for the stuff that's up front. In this case, you're starting the good and the support are billed up front. Services billed as they're consumed. Here, this one is probably arguably less common. We said that the services were billed quarterly in arrears. It was intentional on our part just to put to force the contract into a contract asset position. Whether people bill quarterly or not, probably less frequently, but certainly the fact that there is an asset position, we do see that aspect of it frequently. So this is just a specific instance of that. And then as far as the revenue recognition, the basic processes, probably well understood at this point. There would be an allocation against a standalone selling price for the order. Importantly, and we're focusing, specifically on the service line item here, but that line item could get allocated, again, arbitrary numbers, but let's say it was 100K in value and it gets allocated down to 85K based on standalone selling price. The important thing is that the value of this order now, from a billing perspective, is different from a revenue perspective, different from a fulfillment perspective. That inherently brings one of the challenges into play. And additionally, and again, I think this is a common one, the tangible good, let's call it hardware, the recognition should occur in total, very frequent, but it's contingent on a future delivery event, very common, right? So the system needs to understand that. And then recognition for support ratable over the initial contract period. And again, recognition for services key here. That occurs as the hours are performed in the period in which it's performed. Very common thing. But you start to see a mismatch between the schedule of the recognition of services and the billing events. So that's sort of setting the state for this walkthrough. Next slide. Yep. So the first problem, I think, is fairly straightforward, yet, again, from our perspective, we see this being done through workarounds frequently, or sort of ad hoc processes, but the tangible good is getting delivered at some future point in time. From a billing perspective, fairly straightforward. You're billing, up front. From a rev rec perspective, a little more complicated. Because of the allocation process, et cetera, typically the revenue recognition system would receive this order, would set it up, would perform the allocation, would even set up the schedules for recognition. But now you're into a situation where it requires what we call an asynchronous event. It basically, at least in terms of the tangible good, it is waiting either for a human or for some other system to indicate to it that delivery has occurred. And that needs to be supported in the systems. If you're driving for automation. And so that's the first issue, handling that. And you can go to the next slide. Yep. Problems 2 and 3 relate to recognizing the revenue after allocation. So in this case, and this is an interesting one. So here, we're recognizing the revenue for the services based on performance in the period it's performed. Nothing special there. The key thing is that it's initially going to be recognized ahead of the first quarterly bill. So you will be building up, you will have an asset position. The other interesting thing is that a lot of systems out there, I think the Oracle, the SAPs of the world, et cetera, they were originally designed for the manufacturing world. And revenue recognition is typically triggered, or was anyway, typically triggered off the generation of the invoice, and that becomes a big problem in these situations. Will not apply. And I spoke a little bit to it earlier, but the other problem that exists here, in addition to now a need to manage that asset balance, is the fact that the services have been allocated. So in most of the systems that we've seen, the way the asset and liability balances are managed is, one, keeping track of performance. So what is the total value of the service item? How much has been performed? The other is keeping track of billing and ensuring that the billing system, so not only is the fulfillment system needing to talk to the revenue recognition system, but the billing system also needs to talk to the revenue recognition system so that it understands essentially the position of the contract, but how much of this that's been performed has been billed and how much that has not been performed has been billed. What is tricky and what we're trying to identify in problem 3 here is that services revenue has been allocated. The billing system is unaware that allocation has occurred, so it's passing billing events at the original value. The revenue recognition system is receiving them and needs to be able to compare them to the now allocated services, perform the correct math to make sure everything is trued up. That has been a significant issue for a lot of the organizations that we run into. So that's the third problem that we wanted to call out here. And you can go to the next slide. So the fourth, I talked about a little bit already, but the asset liability requirement. So you have to, you're forced to recognize the revenue ahead of billing. You're forced to keep track of the liability balances, et cetera. So I spoke to this, I guess, in the last slide, but this is where you run into the situation of not only having to have 2 feeds, one from fulfillment, one from billing, to the revenue recognition engine, but that extra piece of logic also to make sure that the billing system, which is at this point unaware of the change in value of the revenue item due to allocation, can properly map these bills coming into to the revenue to get to the proper balance in terms of the asset and liability. And none of this considers FX, which would completely complicate it if you were operating in a multi-currency mode. Okay, next one. So the next one we wanted to speak on a little bit was the combination and modification guidance, and really just to say here that I think what a lot of people, when they're thinking about these problems, they're thinking about just, the initial contract and getting it processed through. We haven't seen a lot of this yet. I mean, the guidance seems pretty clear, in terms of how the modification guidance is written. But, as you sell additional orders to that client, depending on a number of factors in terms of the performance obligation distinct and everything that you see under that guidance, you may have to perform either a retrospective or a prospective reallocation. And very infrequently have I ever seen multiple combination events, but certainly modification events, depending on the type of business it is, you could see multiple over time. And so, it sort of amplifies the issue of the revenue recognition system, because of these additional orders and because of the dictates of that guidance, is performing additional allocations on the total order. It's changing the value of the services, and therefore causing an issue in terms of the systems needing to be somehow synced, that extra piece of logic to map to the now newly allocated value of the service item. And then problem 6, again, I talked about it a little bit, but this is another one of the ones that comes up fairly commonly for us, where the front office really, it's tempting not to have to issue new paperwork and go through that rigmarole. So there's a strong temptation there, for at least from what we've seen, to just follow the process of, if the client says we can keep billing on the current paperwork, we'll go ahead and bill. It's an issue because from a revenue recognition perspective, at least the way we think about the problem is we need to have the revenue teed up in the revenue recognition system to which usage would be applied. So when this overbill situation occurs, unless this is thought about a priori, it won't exist in the revenue recognition system. And so there are options here. The bottom line is it probably will be implemented differently by different people that are supporting this, and there are different ways of operationalizing it. But if you're ideally trying to truly automate this thing, and it is totally doable. I mean, we are doing this for clients right now, and I'm sure there are others doing it through different means. But essentially, as these overbill events are coming, from, or overperform events are coming from the fulfillment system down to the revenue recognition system, it needs to identify that A, it's gone beyond the initial recognition as part of the initial order. B, ensure that that's okay. Create the new amount of revenue in the system, and then manage the recognition properly, including assignment to the proper accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, those in a nutshell are 6 of the, I'll call them new problems that we've seen in the combined processing between billing, fulfillment, and revenue recognition, primarily as a function of 606, although I arguably some of these problems have existed for all of time, but certainly amplified by 606. And I think, Sarah, we have a polling question coming here, don't we?
I was going to say, why don't we launch the second polling question here, which is, which of the following best describes how fulfillment events are handled to drive revenue recognition? So I'll give you guys a chance to answer. Okay, good. Looks like we have just about all of our answers in. Okay, I'll close that, and let's take a look at the results. So 21% have no revenue recognition dependent on fulfillment events. 25% have fulfillment events and manually trigger revenue recognition via human interaction. 46% have fulfillment events that automatically trigger through some sort of integration. And lastly, 8% have fulfillment events and live in a world of Excel and email. So thank you for the responses. Any comments, Tom, on that? Surprises?
No, I think those numbers are typically what we see. So a quarter manual currently. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a question on it, but a good future question when we do these events again would be to understand of those 6 types of problems which they have as well, because I think one of the things that we're seeing with 606 is as people, there are people that currently that have been able to avoid, for example, even allocating in total, even though they have probably a requirement to allocate for at least now. Their auditors are letting them get by with something similar on the modification guidance. So I think that it's somewhat going to be a function of how hard the SEC comes down, how hard auditors come down, how rigidly the guidance is followed, and that if it gets rigid, it may ratchet up the number of things that people have to do kind of, very digitally to adhere to the guidance, which will then correspondingly ratchet up the complexity. And unfortunately, it's not like a linear thing. I think as you add some of these things, it goes kind of exponential. And, that's one of the things that we hope people gain from this is to just understand, okay, what is out there? What's, potentially awaiting me? But yeah, I mean, these answers are pretty close to in line with what we would expect. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go back here. There you go.
I think this is for Greg. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Good segue. Thanks, Tom. I guess what I'll do is I'll speak a little bit about, as Tom indicated, those horrific problems. What we see from a systems perspective, and certainly with Changepoint, is they're largely magnified due to that business chaos. And so if we look at it, although we saw from the survey that a large number of customers are starting to use those systems, one of the things we speak about, and it really is around the automation of fulfillment and the revenue processes and those billing events and the ability to seamlessly communicate that information. That is key. It's not getting better, it's actually getting worse. A couple of reasons for that are, the complexity in the back office. That certainly has spiked. The subscription economy influences that. Back to back, and as Tom had indicated, those standards, whether it's ASC 606 or ASC 842, those things influence organizations' ability to be able to automate. And then certainly the next level of complexity is the cloud. It's certainly introducing new benefits, but it's also introducing those new challenges. This slide certainly is speaking to, all of those elements that you're trying to bring together from an automation perspective. Go ahead and go forward, Sarah. So options to operationalize this problem, there are certainly a few. Number one is around business stability. We look at, as partners between Softrax and Changepoint, ensuring that we're providing that, as I described, that automation between fulfillment and those revenue processes. Clearly, the most important thing is communication. And so regardless of, those other back office systems that you're relying on, that information is seamlessly integrated. So, retain the investment, as an example, in your backbone, whether it's your ERP, AP, AR, and GL. Our position is, and I would use the term agnostic. We are agnostic in the sense we can surround ourselves with the necessary purpose-built modules. So depending on, what's important to our customers and certainly the market, we can make sure that we integrate those elements while maintaining that fulfillment process and revenue recognition process between Changepoint and Softrax. So the ability to be able to upgrade independently is important, or switch out. So we do see that with some of our customers where they look at best of breed solutions, let's say on the CRM side or on the ERP side. And there certainly is a change and evolution in technology and in capabilities and the benefits that can be seen. And as I mentioned earlier, the cloud certainly influences that. Being agile and being able to move quickly is certainly an important component of maintaining and improving your business financial opportunity, and that certainly is one of the things that we see. Stability is around that. Having an agnostic connection so that we can do that integration. So focus on the glue between those components. So whether it's the, augmented intelligence or artificial intelligence user experience, and then ultimately the BI. And those are important components in making sure that we're delivering value between, as Tom has talked about already, those horrific problems which are really between fulfillment and revenue recognition. Go ahead, Sarah. All right, so I spoke a little bit, and I think it's worth identifying. I spoke about the cloud, and I talked about that business agility now. I don't think this is unknown, certainly out there, but I think there are options and advantages, and I think it's important to know. Certainly with Changepoint, there is added benefit, and it might be a little bit different than some of the other vendors in the market space. We are a private cloud SaaS. And private cloud SaaS is certainly different. It's not multi-tenancy, and for those that are stuck on that term, the difference between the two is in a multi-tenancy environment, you are stuck with the vendor on their release and their path from an upgrade perspective. That doesn't insulate you or ensure that you're going to continue to maintain your business viability as features changes, as that experience changes, and certainly because it's multi-tenant from a security perspective, there is some risk. Now, we certainly are getting better when we talk about the cloud platform and SaaS solutions, but there still are those risks for some businesses, and some choose not to go to the cloud because of that. So with the private cloud, we are segregating the database and ensuring that each and every customer has more control around, when they upgrade, what they're upgrading to, and again, that agnostic ability allows them to be able to interchange with the systems that they need to, as we talked about earlier, whether it's your CRMs or your ERPs. There's better scalability. There's greater cost savings, or at least equal to what a multi-tenancy would have. There's feature control as well. You're not stuck into that multi-tenancy role and governed by what everybody else's rules are. Reliability and that uptime is certainly important, and we cover that. And from a security perspective, that also is more secure because the risk is unique to the data that you have access to only. So there's an increased security there. All right, go ahead, Sarah. Thanks. Here we go. So really, in summary, when we talk about Changepoint, and this certainly with our partnership with Softrax, allows us to be able to provide that connection. It allows us to automate and accelerate with those fulfillment capabilities, all the way from opportunity management through that revenue recognition process that Tom has been talking about, in those linkage between fulfillment and revenue and those billing pieces that you need to provide. Okay, Sarah.
And actually, Greg, that brings us into our next polling question here.
Awesome.
So here I'm going to open up the polls. The question now is, which of the following best describes how you are currently managing your professional services workforce? So I'll go ahead and open that up. Give everyone a few more seconds to answer. Okay, looks like we have everyone. See the results here. So 13% don't have a professional services organization. 20% have an organization but use Excel to manage it. And 47% have a professional services workforce and use facilities within their existing ERP platforms to manage it. And 20% have used built-in solutions to manage the services. Greg, any thoughts or comments on that in terms of what you expected?
Not surprised. I think I see somewhat of a transition, interestingly enough, towards those last two. That, certainly what we see the market and our customers, we see them move away from what I would call a one-stop shop, their ERP platform, or certainly not an ERP. They've got a purpose-built solution to manage it. The benefit that we see that our customers are taking advantage of is, as I said, I use that term agnostic, the ability to interchange and switch and become a little bit more agile with and leverage best of breed rather than being hooked into a single purpose-built or from an ERP solution. I think, Tom, you had mentioned it earlier, where ERP has come from typically does not necessarily serve professional services as well. And so we see a lot of the market or a lot of our customers transitioning. I'm most surprised, interestingly enough, at there's 33% that are here today that don't have a solution to manage that, or they have one and they're using Excel. Still, I think that indicates that there's still a lot of maturity within the market that will occur. Especially as I indicated earlier, with the move to the cloud, I think you're going to see a lot more organizations look to be able to do that, and there's less risk. The subscription model is they can get in and get out fairly quickly. They can take advantage of those solutions, adopt those solutions, and pivot if it's not meeting their needs, as we see with that 20%. So I'm not surprised. What would be interesting, I think, Tom, is we take this away and come back in a year and ask that question again to see whether there is somewhat of a transition between those four.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, to my other point, and one of the messages that I hope the viewers will take away is that what we try to describe at the front of this is how things could get more complex, dependent on, how rigidly the guidance is enforced, I guess, is the easiest way to say it. But I think as things get more complex, what you should be thinking about is what is my option? So if it's not supported in the platform, do I double down on customization? Do I augment with some purpose-built module? Do I go to Excel? Those things as things ratchet up. And the other thing I would say is that on the Excel side, one thing to be very careful about is that we've noticed that there's certainly high automation possible. Like the most well-run companies we've seen are doing some very interesting things. They've operationalized, but they're also using things like robotic process automation and others, even to handle things like reconciliation, et cetera. And that structure tends to break down even with a minor injection of Excel. And so a lot of people can't get there right now because they have Excel in place. And it's not exactly an all or nothing thing. But when you think about your strategy going forward, I would say if you're assessing, if you think you may need to do a change, let's say in terms of either the business is changing, how you're following the guidance, et cetera, and you think you may end up having a gap with your system, then prudent to plan for that gap and figure out how you can find a way to handle it without getting to Excel, or in some cases even without getting to some customization. And I say that just so you can preserve the ability, one, to get to that ideal of total automation, but like the RPAs and other things, they can work on Excel, but it's messy. It's not a clean thing, and I think you take a significant hit in terms of the efficiency of the business. So maybe plan for that. Just an observation.
All very good, gentlemen. And with that, I believe, Tom, it brings it back to you.
Yep. So, we talked a little bit about the some of the challenges out there with 606, and Greg spoke a little bit on the fulfillment side, and I wanted to go through this slide just to talk about a little bit more specifically the integration between the systems that would be involved. And these don't have to be, we have systems for order entry, RevRec, billing. Changepoint obviously has a very good fulfillment system, but whatever the systems are, this is an explanation of how we view the integration, how we've implemented it, and some key some key observations here, because this is not just a technology issue, it's a people and a process issue, and I'll try to go through some of that as we go through this. So typically, the process starts with order entry. I would say more and more, and I think it's the right path, we're seeing customers that will take data from a CRM system or possibly a CPQ system and bring it into, in our case, they bring it into our order system and it's just stored there. So the first interesting thing that I've seen is there's a big debate out there in terms of who's responsible for the data. So very often, it does not seem like CRM data is necessarily trusted. So even if it's brought down, there's a step where the accountants review it. Certainly, there's many cases where the accountants are re-entering this data into an order system. My personal belief, based on all these people that I've talked to, is that is strange as it might sound, because most organizations don't run this way, but the thought leaders that I've talked to are pushing the accountability for the quality of the data as far upstream as possible. It's a little non-intuitive, but they're saying that the data in CRM, I've seen it done multiple ways. Either they're forcing accuracy in the data entry itself, and I understand that these are sometimes sales teams and they're running around like crazy, and people are, they really question that. Or alternatively, to address that fact, when the opportunities are closed in CRM, whether it's Salesforce, Dynamics, whatever, maybe then another level of approval occurs, but the focus in either case is on having quality, accurate data in the CRM and passing it down from there. And again, in our case, it goes down to an order entry system. Just to give you some background on it, the reason why they're doing that is because if that were not to be done, there would be corrections to data in the order entry system or further downstream that would cause the systems to potentially go out of sync. So it's an organizational change. Perhaps more people are doing this already than I'm aware of, but it seems fairly new to me, so I bring that out. In our case, in the integration in step 2, so we are thinking of sort of the point of truth at order entry. Part of it, however it gets down there, but starting from order entry, it branches out to fulfillment, to RevRec, and so we're actually in the integration using that data. So let's assume from CRM into order entry, perhaps augmented in order entry. Not every field is always captured in CRM. From there, it goes to the fulfillment system to actually set up the projects. And it's kind of a key step because it enables linkage between other events that are going to occur. So those events would be, linking data between the fulfillment events that occur and the billing system, such that it can process those and bill those, and the revenue recognition system, so that the right revenue in the revenue recognition system is pushed into a recognized state. Same deal with bills going into the recognition system. So we'll walk through it a little bit, but step 2 is moving it up into the fulfillment system, getting it started. For sure, the professional services team and most of the environments I've seen, they end up with like a project created within Changepoint in this case. Things are set up. They then come in and they're adding a lot of data to manage their resources, manages their teams, and continuing on from that. But it gives them a very solid head start, and it sets up all the key identifiers and everything to make sure that subsequent steps flow smoothly. Step 3, data fulfillment. One of the things that has to happen as it's fulfilled, it has to be billed. Clearly, that data goes down to the billing system. Now the identifiers are already set up. The billing system handles generation of the invoice, pushes it out. All of that is fine. The only, there are things like potentially milestones or quantity hours, rates. There's plenty we could talk about on that link, but suffice to say, it's all there and the data flows through. So fourth, and these are not in time sequence, but when the order closes, basically after it passes through order entry, it would pass automatically to the revenue recognition engine. Critical there is that the recognition engine receive total contract value. It receive the SKUs, everything it needs to perform that initial allocation. It typically, ours and everyone I've seen basically will At least the sophisticated ones will store standalone selling price against those SKUs, so it's a table lookup once the SKUs come in. It will set up the revenue for recognition. It will have everything at least ready to go. Some of the recognition starts automatically. Support, for example, it starts automatically or starts potentially contingent on some condition like delivery. Some of the revenue, however, will be contingent, and so that's step 5. So, Changepoint in this case will send down fulfillment events, and so the way you can think about 5 and 6, and I think this is a fundamental change from how systems used to work in the SAP Oracle days. It used to be revenue recognition was triggered off generation of the invoice. Here, what you're seeing is the systems are working in concert, but there is always the mentality of separation of the order to cash process and the order to revenue recognition process. So what you end up having is at points in time as performance occurs, those are captured in Changepoint. And again, I'm seeing the same mentality flow here now where, it was always on the accountants to make sure everything was accurate before. I've seen a lot of pressure just start recently to make the people that are entering the data in the fulfillment system accountable for the accuracy of that data. I have seen it either that they are totally accountable, and I've seen it where they are accountable, but there is an approval step. So in that step 5, as it flows toward the revenue recognition engine, I've seen a step where the accountants will actually review all of it, which in a high volume case probably starts to get untenable unless you have a very large team. But I've seen those both. And again, the reason I'm seeing this trending in this direction, I believe anyway, and talking to most of the people I've talked to, is because they don't want these systems to go out of sync. If they drive the accountability as far upstream as possible, in this case up to Changepoint, then that's the enabler for the automated reconciliations between their fulfillment system, their billing system, their order system, and their revenue recognition system. Hopefully that makes sense. And so you have, in 5 and 6, you have fulfillment driving performance, changing the effectively moving revenue from a deferred state to a recognized state, and you have billing, those events coming in as it should be billed, sometimes coincident with performance, but sometimes not, driving the change in the position of the contract from an asset to a liability position, which is effectively a change in the state of the revenue. Is this revenue, has it been performed? So it should be recognized. Has it been billed so that it's fully recognized? Do I need to disclose an asset? Do I need to disclose a liability, etc.? So those are not all of, but what we think are the primary main integration points, and then obviously the journal entries flow back to the general ledger as the downstream feed. So that gives you some insight into what's happening in from an integration perspective and why it's set up this way. The only other point I would make on this slide, since we have a couple of minutes, is that we mentioned problem 6. So there's nothing to say that fulfillment system could will stop sending performance events down to the revenue recognition engine even after the revenue that was on the original order was consumed. It was part of that allocation, etc. We still see it flow down, and it creates requirements on the revenue recognition end to say, hey, well, this is new revenue. I need to handle it a little bit differently than the other. And too much complexity probably to get into here now, but it's something that needs to be considered. I mean, if you don't consider it, the pushback that we've gotten, it's not the accountants that tend to care. They'd prefer the new paperwork all the time, I'm pretty sure. It's a fulfillment team that doesn't want to go through the hassles, or the sales team or whatever that don't want to go through the hassles to generate the new paperwork, for some slight increase in the scope of the performance, basically. Right. Back to you, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at, just to close out, I think Tom's done a fantastic job of talking about that partnership that we have with Changepoint and Softrax between fulfillment and recognition. Just to further that point, certainly from a future state perspective, and they are buzzwords and you do hear them a lot, but when we talk about our partnership and we talk about where we're going, certainly I refer to it as augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence. And the reason I say that is we want to ensure, in the sense of, excuse me, just like Tom described about that fulfillment process and automating it, we want to make sure there's intelligence around that. So from the fulfillment team, whether it's sales or whether it's those that are engaging with the customer, making sure that there's some decisions that can be made that downstream the accountant doesn't have to worry about, and there's an easier way to process that information. We'll also, excuse me, as an aside, talk about augmented intelligence throughout our solution. We're going to look at our workforce planning area, the resource management, and try to automate that even more. So we take away from that manual, trying to find the resources. We do a great job of being able to capture that information. Let's further that with augmented intelligence and allow organizations or give them decisions to make rather than having them go in to try and investigate and search to find out the best decision. Let's prompt that. Platform modernization, as we talk about in private cloud, certainly there's some investment that we will make there, and even in the Changepoint solution around our capabilities. Certainly breadth and depth, Tom talked about, significant in the sense of configurability and workflow. So the ability to automate that, and I talked about it earlier. If you can automate those processes, take it out of the hands of the individual from a manual perspective, you're actually enhancing their job, their quality, and where they're investing their time. More purpose-built activities than merely having to look after and capture and make sure the data's right. And then lastly, UX is a big topic these days. From an experience perspective, we always look at improving that experience in that what I talked about earlier, that order to cash, all the way from opportunities, the sales orders that come in, all the way through that fulfillment process, ultimately getting that information out to Softrax. So from an experience perspective, we want to make it as seamless and intuitive as possible to ensure that the end users, whoever they are, whether they're project managers, whether they're the engagement managers, whether they're the sales team, is engaged in the actual purpose-built activities. They're doing things that are important to the organization, not merely entering data. Tom, any other additional comments from you?
No, I think that was good. I think I think the intent with the modules is, and one of the benefits is that they're designed, both of them, to be best of breed in their category, which in our case means handling anything that comes up in terms of revenue recognition guidance. And I know from our existing accounts that you guys handle everything that gets thrown at you from a PSA, professional services workforce automation perspective. So I think that the value there is as the business changes, as the guidance, people embrace the guidance, they're there for you. So hopefully it keeps you off the spreadsheets. And then, with some of these new things, I mean, we're fully embracing robotic process automation as an example. It's a means to sort of safely ratchet up the way that you're operationalizing the organization. So, and then Sarah, I think we have another polling question coming up.
We do indeed. The last polling question here is, what is the longest pole in the tent for your close process? I'll give you a little bit of time to answer that. Okay, looks like we're good. Let's review the results here. Okay, so we have 16% is the collection of fulfillment events to drive billing and recognition of revenue. 34% is completing billing and revenue recognition once fulfillment events are known. 27% is the generation of journal entries, and then the last 23% are the reconciliations performed prior to close. Any last comments on these, Tom or Greg?
The one that stands out to me the most here is the generation of journal entries. I would have expected it lines up well. The completing the billing and the rev rec once events are known is typically the leader, by quite a bit. The generation of journal entries, it should be a totally automated process. If if things are operationalized correctly, by the time you effectively hit go on the journal entries, it should just occur through the system processing. There shouldn't be. People are moving away from topsides and other thing, obviously trying to get things clean. So that one's surprising to me. So I'm not sure what potentially is driving that. The collection of the fulfillment events, somewhat surprising. As far as people like entering data into systems, etc., that part should be pretty clean. It's just a question of how the data is passed over. And so I'm not sure. It depends on how people are answering, but where you end up seeing the pain point is where we see it here, that second line, completing the billing and the rev rec once the events are known, because there's all kinds of like checks and processes that typically need to occur to make sure everything is perfectly correct. And so, one of the challenges, I think, if in operationalizing, is getting that number down very low such that those are both automated processes, really 2 and 3. Arguably right now, 2 and 3 should be perfectly automated processes if things are set up correctly. 4 arguably should be totally automated, but it depends on if you're running through a platform or through multiple solutions. The tier 1 accounts, we go into these things and there's many systems out there that need to get reconciled, but I think that at worst case, the answer for 4 would be through robotic process automation, and it needs to be set up carefully. So I would say, I have not seen a number of companies that have resolved 4. I have seen a number that have resolved 2 and 3, but I think they are getting toward 4, primarily, in my opinion, through RPA. But, Greg, I don't know if you have any comment there too.
No, I echo those thoughts, especially towards the point 3 and 4.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting one. So we'll put this in future surveys and see how these stats change.
Thanks, guys. And with that, I believe that takes us to any questions that anyone might have before we get some closing remarks. It doesn't look like we have any questions today. So Tom and Greg, any closing remarks you guys want to make before we end today's webinar?
No, just thank you all for participating. If you have questions after the fact, feel free to email either Greg or myself. We both really enjoy interacting with our clients, our partners, and people just interested in the solution. So we were happy to speak anytime. Speaking for you, Greg, hope that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I again echo those thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we thank you for your time.
All right. Well, with that, thank you both, and thanks everyone for attending. And if you have any additional questions, just feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sarah. Have a great day.